Okay guys, so we are back working on the Miata again. In the last episode you saw we prepped the engine bay area to be able to remove the engine and the transmission from the car. Today we'll be working underneath the car, so we need to get the exhaust, the drive shaft, the PPF all disconnected, the wiring to the transmission as well. It's a little bit more like gritty work being on the ground under the car, but it's not too bad. We'll show you guys how to do that. The worst smelling fluid on the planet. This one is the transmission to differential PPF, they call it. It's essentially the cross member for the transmission and the rear differential. These are the two mounting bolts that go up through the PPF, through the differential, and there's a splined nut up on the top side here that the bolt just squeezes everything down together around. The easiest way to get that spline nut off is put the bolt back in, thread it by hand, like 3 or 4 threads, and then hit the bolt with a hammer to push that spline nut out the top, and just unthread either the nut or the bolt. So once you've hammered the bolt up into the nut, this is what you're left with. This end here splines itself down into the PPF, and that's what holds it in there while you can tighten and loosen the bolt. The problem that we're having right now is on this bolt, it's just spinning the nut up on the top. So I'm gonna have to try to get like a pair of vice grips or something up there to hold it. There's enough room for the tool, my hand, or for me to see, but not all three.
Oh, something happened.
Vice grip just jammed up against the axle, which is
good.
Yeah. Okay, so bolt is out. We'll see if that nut, oh yeah. You can see the splines just flattened out right here. So they just weren't strong enough to hold against the tension of the bolt, and our captive nut was just spinning up there. So we'll replace these for sure before we put this back together. We don't want to have that happen again. So once you've got the bolts out from the PPF with the nuts up top, there's one more piece that kind of locates the differential to the PPF, and that's this, we'll call it a bushing. If you look around the edge of the bushing, there's going to be a slot right here on ours. So you can actually get a pry tool or something in there. You need to pull the bushing down from the differential and the PPF. Otherwise, you'll never be able to get the whole bracket off of the diff. So then, just like you saw me do with a chisel or a pry bar with a striking edge, just work it out from off the bracket. Take your time, do it slow, do a little bit on each side. This one actually has a flat spot on both sides. Don't damage this. Don't try to force the PPF off the differential. Once this comes out, you could see the differential dropped just a little bit. Once it's off, everything is pretty loose. That's how you need it to be before you start trying to take the PPF right off. So just make sure everything is free. Don't go try to force anything. You will break it, damage it, or end up with a seized bolt. The biggest issue with these Miatas, ours especially, is like really rusty. What happens is these bolts actually go up through the top and bottom bushing. So this bolt goes through that bushing and it sits inside this channel. What happens is moisture collects on the shank of this bolt, and it'll rust out this bolt here really bad. And what happens is you can't see it, but if you go to hit this with an impact gun to break the bolt loose, it'll actually just snap the bolt off right here, and then you're stuck with that captive nut and half the bolt inside the diff, and you're in a big heap of trouble once you get there. You have to try to extract the bolt out. You can try to hit it with a punch to get the nut off, but then you run into the body of the car. There's not enough room. I've seen it where you need to like remove the whole differential and the PPF as one unit just to be able to get that bolt out. So take your time with this. If you need to, use some heat, warm up the whole body of the differential to get this bolt loose. Always hand tools to take these bolts out. Now that we've got the rear differential unbolted, we're gonna undo the ground wire and pop off all the clips for the wiring harness, and essentially just kind of work our way forward towards the transmission now. So we're gonna drop the entire catback exhaust, get it out of our way, and then we're gonna drop the PPF. We don't need it up here. It's a couple bolts, just get everything out of your way. And just with a pair of needle nose pliers, there's all the wiring harness clips on the PPF. So once you've got the exhaust out of the way, it's a lot easier to see. You just need to depress 2 tabs on the clip, push it back through the PPF. So there's about 6 or 7 of them that run the length of it. Okay, so I do have to pull the speedo cable up first. Actually, I'll pull these 2, and then I'll drop the drive shaft. Oh, whoops.
Did you bend something when hammering?
Yep. And then I broke a little stud. I'll fix that once the transmission is out. Okay, so I think there's one more clip behind here, and then there's one more up there. So all this is kind of precariously sitting here. Once you've got the bolt out of the PPF, it should just kind of slide off the transmission like that.
Your head.
That thing's just big and awkward. I'm gonna put the drain pan back here. When you pull the drive shaft out, it's possible some gear oil can leak out of the output shaft seal. So I'll just pop the drive shaft off the differential, just get a pry bar into the U-joint. I think. Oh, there we go. Normally it's not that difficult. And ours was dry. You won't be able to see it from there. So pretty much like straight up. We're just gonna undo the wiring harness. This is for the reverse lights. So you just depress the tab and pull the harnesses apart. That side stays on the car. And then right up here, there's one bolt that we need to take off for the bracket holding the wiring harness to the transmission. That one's a 10 mil. Last is the slave cylinder. So there's 2 bolts that hold the slave cylinder on. One 12 millimeter at the bottom and one 12 millimeter up on the top side. This is gonna be a bit jarring. Damn. Okay, so this is gonna kind of go ping and then come loose. And so that is the bell housing bolt onto the transmission. Oh, got it. Oh.
What happened?
The piston or the push rod fell out of the slave cylinder. Oh, but that's not a big deal. But it's just the boot there that's ripped. We'll be replacing the slave cylinder anyway. Okay, so that released that bracket. So now I gotta pull the 14 mil top starter bolt that's way up. Oh man, that one was like loose. Okay, so we need to remove the shifter, everything, so it doesn't get hung up while we're pulling the engine, the transmission out the front of the car. Sometimes this car surprises me. Okay, do the same thing on the other side, I guess. Okay, cool. So we just finished up underneath the car, getting the drive shaft off, the PPF, the exhaust, and then undoing everything attached to the transmission. We were taking a look under there. When we unbolted the cat back exhaust, we decided, you know what, let's get the header and downpipe off before we pull the engine out now as well. It'll be a bit easier to manage inside the car, and it'll make pulling the engine and transmission out easier with it out of the way. So we're gonna pull off the heat shield from the exhaust manifold. The bolts on this are really rusty, so I'm gonna use what's called an impact driver. It's pretty much a screwdriver that you can hit the back of with a hammer, and that often shocks the bolt to release the rust to come out easier than just snapping the bolt off inside the manifold. I'm surprised at how well these are coming off, knowing this car. Huh. The bracket actually snapped off the manifold while I was undoing the last bolt, but that's okay. We don't need this anyway.
We don't need the heat shield?
Now you can see all the mounting bolts, or nuts, sorry, to get the header off the cylinder head. So I'm gonna just crack them all loose. You know what I'm gonna do before I break it is pull the dipstick out. Ours, oddly enough, is one of the dipsticks that isn't broken yet. So pull that off. I'm gonna hide it in the cowl for now, and that way it'll stay safe. You know what I need to do first is just reroute the wiring harness for the O2 sensor so that we can take the O2 sensor with the wiring, everything off all as one. So similar to the tabs on the PPF, you just gotta pinch the bottom side of the connector to be able to release it from the bracket. So it's just one more clip on the engine separator plate down there that the O2 sensor wire just kind of rests in. So you can just pull that one out and then route your wire through so that it's not in the way. There's one bracket on the top that is just a location to bolt the heat shield to. And then on the bottom is actually the crossover pipe that goes from the water pump outlet back here for one of the heater hoses. And there's a bracket for it that also goes over one of the exhaust manifold studs. So just slide that pipe with the bracket off of that stud. I think that will give us enough clearance. We've got all the hardware off. The manifold should just pull off and we should be able to take it off with the downpipe. Just like that. I don't want to crack the nice oil cap with the chain when we lift the engine up, so I'm going to take it off. I have a original one. I guess we'll put that plastic original one on.
An atmospheric river is drenching southwestern BC, where flooding and landslides have already disrupted the lives of thousands of people.
Water rushes underneath a now completely severed section of the Coquihalla Highway.
Look at this bridge. There's nothing left of it.
The busiest route through BC's mountains is now impossible to pass.
I'm going to pick it up closer to the rear of the engine because we've got all the way to the transmission coming out the back. Okay, so we've got our engine hoist or cherry picker, whatever you want to call it, set up underneath the car and hooked over top of the engine to be able to lift the whole engine and the transmission up and out of the engine bay as one unit. And so as we're lifting, we'll have to kind of accommodate for the weight of the transmission and to clear the radiator support and all this stuff. So you got to be careful how you're lifting and pulling the engine out. But we've got our chain hooked up pretty solid, as tight to the valve cover as we can. And we've got our engine hoist all set up to be able to hold the weight of the engine and the transmission once we get it out. We just jack up from here and it will start raising the engine. What we need to do is get the engine off the motor mounts from within the subframe, and then we can start pulling it forward. There, we're starting to come out of one engine mount, and that's pretty much free now. I'm going to come up just a little bit more. We still have our fuel lines connected, so those will come undone very last, but I'm just going to pull the engine and the transmission the slightest bit away. Oh, and we're caught on something. There was actually a little tab that hooked onto the tunnel, so as I'm lifting up, I need to tilt the front of the engine up. Yeah, now we're good. I want to make sure we get the fuel lines undone before I pull the engine out anymore. And then we'll make sure that all of our wiring harnesses and everything else is free. So you just squeeze the tabs together and then pull the clamp back from the fuel line. I've noticed that the pliers are just kind of pulling the hose apart. We'll replace all these fuel lines as everything goes back together anyway. There might still be fuel pressure in here. I can't remember if we bled the fuel pressure at all, so it's not uncommon to lose a bit of gas. I think we must have drained it, so we're good there. I'll disconnect the other hose. A little bit of fuel still remaining in the fuel rail. Sop up as much of it with a rag as we can. Our last obstacle, the engine mount is hitting on the power steering hose. I really don't want to have to disconnect this hose at this time, so I'm going to try to shift the whole engine towards the passenger side. I don't know if that mount is supposed to be two pieces or if that's just like a safety cup that's around it. So I'm going to jack the engine up, see if it comes out. I think this is just a cup that encases the factory mount. So this may or may not get reinstalled when we put the engine back in, depending on what engine mounts we decide to run on the car. I'm looking at my angle here, and I've got a feeling the transmission is already right up against the tunnel. So what I'm going to do is just drop the engine down. It's going to sit on the sway bar, and then I'm going to reposition my chain to pick it up closer to the front so we get more tilt. We'll put the chain closer to the front hook. Okay, so what we should get now is a lot more tilt on the engine to clear the crank pulley on the rad support before the transmission hits the transmission tunnel back here, and that'll give us the right angle to be able to pull up and out. I think there's a wiring harness still attached to the transmission. Yeah, there is. Our reverse light switch. It's just a continuous back and forth of up, forward, up, forward, up, forward.
Cool.
So, as you can see, engine is out of the car, transmission is out. We've got the drivetrain essentially stripped out of the vehicle. The main power wiring harness that runs down the transmission tunnel, we just strapped that to the speedo cable bracket on the firewall. Now at least we can roll the car around. That'll give us the ability to work on each subsystem individually. Engine and transmission are out. We've got a lot of work still to do ahead on the engine bay now. All the wiring, vacuum lines, brake hoses, everything we're gonna clean up, and there is quite a bit of surface rust on everything under here. So we're gonna get all that prepped before we show you guys what's coming up next, but we've got some big surprises. Again, if you guys are liking the content, give us a thumbs up, subscribe, and keep watching. Thanks, guys.